banger of a day out here in Durban today. Just beautiful. Got a massive butterfly flying around here. One of the perks of sitting outside like this is number one, reduce costs. And days like this, of course, some negatives as well. I get rained out often, and the sound isn't always the best. But I'm just appreciating today the privilege of doing this out here in the sun. It's just a beautiful, absolutely beautiful day out here in Durban. We're busy with the oldest myth in the Bible, and this is part 6. Last week in part 5, we were having a closer look at the Baal cycle from the Ugaritic text, which is closely related to Canaanite mythology, religion, etc., and how it is tremendously similar to some of the depictions of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, specifically with regards to fighting the Lotan, the Leviathan, a 7-headed monster, or in the account where he fights the sea god Yam, and also eventually fights Death Mot as well, and actually gets killed, and he dies, and his sister comes and he gets resurrected and then gets enthroned as the king. There's so many similarities to places like Isaiah 27, Job, and also some of the Psalms, which we've kind of looked at in detail. Today I want to move on a little bit, before I move on, also last week, one of the central points was, if we look very closely, it seems like if we look at the major theme of the book of Revelation, the New Testament text, it seems to be a very similar ancient trope of a God, in this case, God Yahweh, of course, and his son, the enthroned king, coming to destroy the beasts that come out of the sea. And so death is forever conquered, and he is enthroned as king in an everlasting kingdom. You know, that's the basic narrative of the book of Revelation. Whether you you might interpret it slightly differently. Some people look at it from a preterist point of view. Some look at it to a futuristic point of view. It's besides the point here. It's a very, very similar trope than the ancient Chaoskampf motif, which is this idea that the gods have to fight chaos monsters in order to bring order or kingship or initiate the ordering of the cosmos. Today I want to go a little bit deeper, and first we're going to go really wide, and then we'll come a little bit closer to have a look at some more similarities between Baal and Yahweh. But specifically, I would like to spend some time on the Storm God motif. Now, I have to say this, that when I first started investigating this matter, and I saw a lot of scholars make a lot of hoo-ha about storm gods, I did not really understand why, because my knowledge of the ancient mythologies and religions was just too limited to really understand what the big deal was. I tried to explain a little bit last week that storm gods were immensely powerful gods, and for the very simple reason, I think if you could reduce it to something, they controlled rain. And rain was what agrarian societies lived off. No rain, you die of famine. Good rain, you prosper. Too much rain, and you absolutely flood, and there's death all over the place. And for this reason, the storm gods were immensely powerful gods, and they rallied a lot of worship, and their cults were seemingly quite well established. Putting that aside, what now seems quite apparent to me is that this idea is not just an idea that we find in the Levant. It's not just an idea we see in the Hebrew Bible. It's also not an idea that we only see from the areas surrounding Israel. For instance, to the east, we have Mesopotamia. To the south, we have Egypt. To the north, we have Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And to the left, we have the Mycenaean ancient culture from which the Greek cultures come. The storm god motif you find even wider than that. And this really does blow my mind. And I want to mention it here because there seems to be some ubiquitous motif in the world in this ancient period. I made a list of all the storm gods that I could find, their names and their the name of the chaos monster slash sea that they had to fight in the beginning. And I want to just read them out for you because to me it's absolutely mind blowing. I thought this was just something someone thought up in the ancient Near East, isolated from the rest of the world, but it does not seem to be the case. Now, you can make a case that the ancient Near East, which includes Egypt, Levant, Mesopotamia, and probably Anatolia, that they could have influenced one another, even the Western Macedonian societies. They could have influenced one another. And I think it's quite easy to show that they did. And that's actually what this whole ancient myth, oldest myth in the Bible is about, to show how the Hebrew writers and the Israelite culture was absolutely not only influenced by Canaanite mythology, but actually came from Canaanite mythology. But here's the list. Let me just get to it quickly. It's seems to be quite exhaustive, but I'm sure there are more examples. I'm gonna read. Haven't memorized this, but I'm gonna read through it very quickly and briefly, and you can do your own research if this type of thing tickles your fancy. Let me give you this. I'm not going to give you any details. I just want to get the name, the culture, the name of the storm god, and the name of the dragon slash chaos monster that the storm god has to fight to inaugurate order in the cosmos or a type of kingship above gods. All right, so in the Vedic or the Indian culture, we have the god Indra that fights Vritra. In the Greek culture, we have Zeus, and I'm going to say a couple of things about Zeus today, who fights Typhon. In the Hittite Hurrian culture, we have Teshub, which seems to be one of the oldest great-granddads of Baal, in fact, who fights Ilonanka. In the Babylonian or the Mesopotamian culture, we have Marduk, who fights Tiamat. In the Canaanite or the Levantine culture, we have Baal Hadad, who fights Yam, Mot, and Lotan or Leviathan. In the Norse culture, we have Thor, who fights Jormungandr. Okay. In the Slavic culture, we have Puran, who fights Veles. In the Egyptian culture, we have Set, who fights Apep or Apophis. In Japanese culture, we have Susanoo, who fights Yamata no Orechi. In the Celtic or the Gaelish culture, we have Taranis, which the monster has no name. Right, next one, next page. In the Sumerian culture, we have Ukur, who fights Kur, a chaotic underworld type of dragon. In Mesopotamian or Sumerian culture, we have Ninurta, we mentioned him last time, who fights Asag, which, according to the plaque we find from the 3rd millennium, is a 7-headed monster. This corroborates Ugaritic language of Baal fighting a 7-headed Leviathan. And the next time I see this thing is in Revelation. Like, there's something to be said for that. Then we have the Akkadian or the Semitic culture, in which Hadad or Adad fights Tiamat or Yam. This seems to be the precursor or the antecedent for Baal Hadad. There seem to have been some identification between Baal and Hadad. Right, then in the Phoenician culture, we have Melquart, who hypothetically, as far as I understand, fights Yam. In the Israelite Hebrew culture, we have Yahweh, who fights Leviathan or Rahab or Yam, the sea. In the Sumerian culture, we have Enlil, some of the oldest ancient Near Eastern gods, who fights Anzu, a type of a chaotic bird that steals power. And then in the Greek, we have Apollo that fights Python. In the Hindu or Indian culture, we have Shiva or Rudra, who fights Andhaka or Vritra in later myths. I think I've mentioned a version of this very early on. In the Aztec people, the Aztec culture, this is in the Americas. I mean, we're separated by the Atlantic Ocean here. How in the world? The Aztec cultures have Tlaloc, who fights chaotic floodwaters. Believe that. Or Huitzilopochtli, who fights, my word, Coyolaqua-Quachi, chaos goddess moon, whatever. All right, the point is, this trope is all over the place. There's some exceptions, as far as I know. I might be wrong on this, but Central to Southern Africa doesn't seem to have this type of myth. Egypt does, which is at the north, but I think Egypt should be included in Mesopotamian in ancient Near Eastern culture because they were close enough. Also, I don't think we have anything from the Aborigines from Australia. I think I know, possibly know why, because it was steeped in animism for a very, very long time, and that polytheism didn't develop there to the degree that it did in the, for instance, the nations, that early civilizations, right? The Indus Valley civilizations, the ancient Near Eastern civilization, and then also the Aztec civilizations, and of course the Egyptian civilization. All right, so there are storm gods all over the place. And I think it's easy to explain. I think at least one could put forth a logical explanation for this. People planted plants to eat from, and they needed rain. And they saw rain as a gift from the gods. At the same time, they had to contend with these storms that could literally take the lives of villages, floods, thunder, etc. And so they associated this with a storm type of deity, and this deity became well known. Obviously, there were many other types of gods and that had other attributes, goddess of love, etc., war, and so on. But this idea of storm god seems to have been very important in the ancient times. It is then also no surprise that we would find this type of motif within the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible, the people of Israel did not live in a vacuum. They were not isolated from everybody else around them. That they did not fall from heaven. They were part of the culture of their time, and they developed that culture also. So let's focus a little bit on some of the storm gods in the ancient Near East. These are the neighbors of Israel. Across the ancient Near East, Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia, storm gods played a vital role in mythology, religion, and also politics, because these things were all intermeshed back then. These deities often depicted wielding thunderbolts. Now, there's two or three ideas that are very closely associated with storm gods. The one is the idea of thunder and lightning. Thunder often is related to the voice of the god. Like when it was thundering, that's the god showing his anger in some way or his presence through his voice. And then there was also the type of idea that lightning was the weapon of the god. It was kind of like spears that he was throwing or arrows that he was shooting. And obviously, if you know anything about lightning strikes a tree, you normally have some form of fire. And so there were these arrows of fire that the gods were shooting down at people, and obviously absolutely horrific to think that this is not just a natural phenomena. There's this deity above the clouds that's hunting people with lightning bolts and killing people with lightning bolts. And when you see, oh yeah, okay, so lightning bolts and thunder were part of the armory, if you'd like to say the epithets of these storm gods. Then, of course, there was the idea of the clouds themselves. As you would know, clouds are normally the thing you see first before the storm comes. And so once the clouds started brewing and becoming dark and blotting out the sun and started collecting, becoming denser and darker, this was a precursor for, there is absolute, this God is on his way. And so often the clouds are depicted as the vehicle upon which the God rides to come and deliver rain, floods, storms, lightning bolts, etc. I mean, just from a phenomenological point of view, if you go out next time when there's a storm and put yourself back into the ancient days and imagine there's an actual deity with arms and legs above that cloud, and this is the way he comes to punish, it is absolutely traumatizing. Uh, to some degree, I can understand why they made such a big issue of these gods, because storms are traumatizing. Modern people, I don't know, South Africa, we don't have that many storms. Lately in KZN, we've had some serious floods and storms, and we have lightning from time to time. No real hurricanes or anything like that, but it just makes a lot of sense to me how traumatizing this type of idea might have been. There was something else I wanted to say now. Slipped my mind completely. All right, so these deities often depicted wielding thunderbolts or riding mighty bulls. Oh, yes, that's the other thing. The other thing that's quite interesting is an association of the storm gods with the bull. the actual, bullocks, a bull, a cow bull, the male version, the thing with horns, which in the ancient times seems to have depicted the idea of absolute strength and power. And this is something which, in two ways, the storm gods seem to have been associated with bulls. One of the ways is they are depicted in some of the most ancient iconographies as riding on a bull, but standing and riding on a bull. That's rather interesting. And in the second way, it seems also that the bull was kind of a symbol in some places, in some forms, for these very strong and powerful storm gods. So that's kind of the I think we can. This could be shown from literature, ancient literature, but also from iconography. In other words, ancient placards, ancient stelae, writings on walls, amulets, seals, etc. All the ways in which people, ostraka, the ways in which people wrote down or depicted the gods of their time. Um, so they were not just symbols of destructive storms, but also of life-giving rain, kingship, and divine power. So often what you would find is that this god, who was a storm god, there's often a myth of this god becoming the king of the gods by defeating chaos, storm, or the seas. So it's more than that. It's more than just that they were powerful. They kind of, in many places, places like the Enuma Elish Marduk, the Baal cycle, um, Baal himself, they actually become the king of the gods. Their father, the high god, is still there. He's kind of retired, the wise old guy with a beard on a throne. But his son Baal is running the show because he's been enthroned as king of the gods because he was able to beat the chaos. So in the Baal cycle, it's Yam, the sea god, who is fighting with Baal for exactly this, the kingship of the gods. And of course, Baal is then the ultimate victor as he defeats chaos and death to be enthroned. So although there is still the high god El, his father, that's actually the main dude, the father, and like they understood this as father and son type of relationship. Baal is the one who judges, who runs the show, who gives rain and brings the storms. This seems to be quite normal for the storm god to be at some point in the myth to be elevated above the other gods. Okay, though each culture has its own name and interpretation, concept of a storm god remained remarkably consistent across regions. And this is the reason why scholars would classify some gods as storm gods, because there's such a remarkable similarity in the epithets used and in the literature, the iconography, and the actual mythological stories about these storm gods. All right, so let's talk about Mesopotamia for a moment. Mesopotamia and the West Semitic world. There we had the storm god Adad or Hadad. It seems to me, as far as I can see, that this is one of the earliest storm gods in ancient Mesopotamia and is the precursor for storm gods like Teshub from the Hittite world, Hurrian world, Baal Hadad from the Levant, and also possibly the ideas that Zeus at some point picked up storm god attributes is possibly also influenced by this very early storm god Hadad in ancient Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia and the broader Semitic world, the storm god known as Adad in Akkadian or Hadad in West Semitic, that was his name, sorry. He was worshipped from at least 2000 BCE and was seen as the bringer of both devastating storms and much needed rain for crops. He was often portrayed with a thunderbolt in hand. This is rather important. And sometimes is associated with a bull, an animal symbolizing strength but also fertility. Yeah, sorry, that's the other thing I haven't mentioned, that the storm gods were also closely related to fertility, and that's simply just because rain would fertilize. Well, rain doesn't fertilize crops, but rain makes crops grow. And in a world where science is absolutely absent, they have noticed without rain, there's no growth, there's no food, and people die, right? So texts from Mari and Ugarit, 1800 to 1200 BCE, along with some Akkadian myths like the Enuma Elish from around 1100, 1200 BCE, provide evidence for the worship of Hadad or Adad as an ancient Mesopotamian storm god. Then we also have in Egypt. Now, Egypt is, in my view, commonly somehow separate from the ancient Near East in that they had their own things. They were really early civilization as well, very different from the rest of ancient Near East. But even here, we have a god that's very strongly associated with storms. The god's name was Set. Right. So while Egypt didn't have a traditional storm god in the same way as Mesopotamia, Set or Seth took on a very similar role. Dating back to 3000 BCE, Set was originally the god of the desert and chaos, but he also had strong connections to storms and foreign lands. He was depicted as a strange composite animal with a long snout and a forked tail. Egyptian texts such as the Pyramid text, 2400 BCE, mention Set's power over the winds and the storms. And by the New Kingdom, which is 1500 to 1100 BCE, the Late Bronze Age, he was likened to the Syrian storm god Baal Hadad. Now you see how there's a connection between these things. Temple reliefs from the Ramesside period even show Set wielding a thunderbolt, reinforcing his stormy nature. All right, let's move on to, before we get to the Levant, let's first move to Anatolia. Now, Anatolia is north of Israel, north of Syria, north of the Levant then, and it's modern-day Turkey, where the biblical Hittites would have been. Now, in Anatolia, there was a storm god by the name of Teshub, or Tarhuns. I hope I'm pronouncing these things correctly. In Anatolia, the storm god took the form of Tarhuns in the Hittite and Tarhunta in the Luwian, or Teshub in the Hurrian. By 600 BCE, he had become the supreme deity of the Hittite and Hurrian pantheon, ruling over storms, fertility, and kingship. His imagery was striking. He was often depicted standing on a bull, wielding a massive thunderbolt. So you can see there's a real theme that runs through the depictions of these gods. The Iluyanka myth of 1500 BCE is a Hittite legend, and it describes Teshub's struggles with a great serpent. Hello, a common theme in storm god mythology. His importance is further confirmed by Yazilikaya rock carvings from 1300 BCE and royal inscriptions from the Hittite Empire 1400 to 1200 BCE. All right, so now we get to a little bit closer to home, and this is Baal. In the Levant, which would have been modern-day western Syria, down through Canaan, bordering on Egypt in the south, including what today is Israel, or was Israel back then as well. The most well-known storm god in the Levant was Baal. His name literally means Lord, though he was also identified with Hadad. So basically, this means, when we say identified, we mean that Baal was at some point identified with the Mesopotamian storm god Hadad. In other words, Baal probably took on the storm god characteristics of the Mesopotamian Hadad. So this was common for gods to morph in this way and take on, as they were promoted, they take on the attributes, the iconography, the epithets of other gods. And so they were built up stronger and stronger. This all happens, of course, in the minds of the people. The only way we know this is from the writings they left us. By 2000 BCE, Baal had become one of the most significant gods in the region, especially in Ugarit, modern-day Syria. He was god of rain, fertility, kingship, ensuring that crops would grow and that the rulers maintained divine favor. He was often depicted holding a club and a lightning bolt, symbolizing his control over the weather. The Baal cycle, which from Ugarit, which we've spoken about, 1300 BCE, tells of his battles against other gods to establish his dominance. Egyptian records, even in 1500 BCE, and the Bible in 1 Kings 18 from around 600 BCE, they all reference Baal, showing how widespread the fame and influence of the god Baal was. All right, so we've dealt with all the surrounding neighbors of what we would consider ancient Israelites. Just one or two last things about storm gods, and then you can consider yourself educated. Storm gods are more than just weather deities. These storm gods weren't just forces of nature. They played a crucial role in shaping ancient societies. They symbolized also divine kingship, controlled the agriculture, and sometimes they even represented foreign power and chaos. Whether it was Adad in Mesopotamia, Set in Egypt, Baal in the Levant, or Tarhuns in Anatolia, the storm god remained a dominant figure across the ancient world. Now, let's talk about Baal as we closing our circle. We went from worldwide, Aztec, and Japan. We came to the ancient Near East, and now we're going to be focusing ourselves on Canaanite or the Levant storm god Baal. And we're doing all of this because we want to show how it influenced the way that the Israelites understood Yahweh. Baal Hadad was the northwest Semitic storm god. And in the Ugaritic text, as well as in visual depictions, he uses lightning bolts as spears. One text describes his weapons as 7 lightnings, 8 storehouses of thunders, and his spear as a shaft of lightning. Now, there's a stele in the Louvre, and I've actually been to the Louvre. I wish I could just get back to the Louvre because I walked past so many things that I had no idea what they were, what they meant, and now I do, and I'm stuck in Durban. And I wish I could just go back there to go see all these things I now research and know about. Uh, maybe one day, maybe one day. But every time I read in the Louvre, I want to kick myself because I probably walked past it. But there's a stele from 700 to 400 BCE that's currently in the Louvre. I've got a picture of it here. And it's the god Baal standing with a spear, a lightning spear in the one hand. And the stele can now be seen in the Louvre. Now, here's the thing. In the Bible, Yahweh is also described using storm god imagery. And that's quite a strong feature of the God Yahweh in the Bible, which tells us that at some point in the history of the Israelites, they understood Yahweh to be a storm god. Sorry, there's a little gecko on top of my head. I hope it doesn't fall on me. They also understood Yahweh to be a storm god. Now, that does make sense from a lot. Just it logically makes sense that a small group in the ancient Levant would see their patron deity at some point as having storm god attributes, right? Now, it's unsettling for Christians who read that today because they feel that it is diminutive of someone to, sorry, that's the wrong word. It minimizes the God Yahweh, which today Christians believe that that's the creator, the only God that ever existed, that made everything from the beginning. It's very discomforting to think that at some point he was understood as a local deity who took on storm attributes from the guy next door. But I think it does make a lot of sense just in terms of understanding Israel as part of the Levant, as part of the ancient Near East, not as something separate to it. But the ideas about God developed in a very natural way within Israel. Okay, anyway, so in the Bible, we see Yahweh also described as storm god in storm god imagery, since he effectively took Baal's place in the Israelite religion. So we want to, we spent a bit of time on this, but it seems more likely that the Israelites actually just were Canaanites that initially worshipped Baal and El. That's just what things point at. And there's archaeological evidence for all of this, which is not the point of today. And that later on, they started identifying Yahweh with El, the high God. Yahweh took on the attributes of Baal because you need someone to run the storms for you and create a flood for you. And that this is the reason why Baal is depicted in the Hebrew Bible as the main rival of Yahweh worship. Because this was during the period that Yahweh was taking on storm god imagery, and the prophets and the kings of later time, from Josiah, Hezekiah, started pushing for a more monolatrous religious environment, meaning that Yahweh was the high God and everybody else was down here, almost as his sons as some scriptures actually kind of depict. But he would then be responsible for storms. All right, so like Baal, Yahweh's armament includes the use of lightning spears, and it's quite interesting how often the Bible actually depicts the God Yahweh in this way. Spears, lightning spears or arrows, the infliction of a spear that creates fire, like fire falling from the sky, this type of thing, is actually quite common in the Bible. And especially in the portions that deal with Chaoskampf motifs. Chaoskampf, if you're watching for the first time, is the early idea that gods had to fight chaos in the form of the chaos seas or the chaos sea monsters in order to bring order or to be crowned as king of the gods. This seems to be what's happening in Psalm 104. It's a creation psalm. It doesn't really sound like Genesis 1, and we'll talk about that later. But it seems like this is what it's referring to when it says, you make the wind your messengers. Fire and flame are your ministers. Psalm 104 verse 4. Similarly, in Psalm 18, it is full of thunder and lightning imagery, along with allusions to the primordial sea, the chaos sea, in its description of Yahweh that goes into combat. Now, I just want you to read this maybe you could, if you've been following the series up to now, maybe you could for the first time read Psalm 18 from an ancient perspective and not from a modern monotheist perspective. Verse 13, Psalm 18. The Lord, or Yahweh, thunders in the heavens, right? And the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yes, he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered. Which seems to be typical storm god imagery here in Psalm 18. Habakkuk 3 verse 11 describes Yahweh as having glowing arrows and a flashing spear. Job 37 2-4 describes the voice of Yahweh as thunders that let loose his lightnings to the corners of the earth. Another interesting parallel is found in Psalm 29, which mentions the voice of Yahweh exactly 7 times, implying 7 thunderbolts as his weapons. The psalm then declares Yahweh's kingship, using very similar words that we find in a Baal tablet. This thing's going to fall on my head. Okay, well, another con for doing stuff outside here. I've got a roof that looks like that. And I think I've got a little visitor here today. I'm just worried he's going to poo on my head or something. Anyway, right, here is a little portion from the Ugaritic text. It's a praise psalm, seems, for Baal. It goes like this. Baal sits enthroned, like the sitting of a mountain. Hadad, the shepherd, like the flood. So here it pictures Baal. It identifies with Hadad, the Mesopotamian storm god. And he sits enthroned like the flood. And then we have this, and it carries on and says, in the midst of his mountain, the god of Saphon. Saphon seems to be the mountain from where Baal was from. The mountain of victory, 7 lightnings, 8 storehouses of thunder, the shaft of lightning. So this is the picture it paints of Baal in the Ugaritic text. Then we go to Psalm 29, verse 10. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but listen to the similar language. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Okay, that's very, very similar. It's very particular. In other words, Yahweh is in control of the floods, not Baal. Yahweh is in control of the floods. And it seems like what the Ugaritic text is doing to Hadad, it's assuming Hadad's characteristics for Baal Hadad. The Bible does exactly that by assuming the characteristics of Baal Hadad for Yahweh. It just feels like it's too obvious that it just can't be ignored. Another text portrays lightning as God's weapon. This is in Psalm 77, 16-19. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid. The waters are afraid, right? The depths are also troubled. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent forth a sound. Your arrows also went abroad. The voice of your thunder was in heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. The way is in the sea, and your path in the great waters, and your footsteps are not known. Right. So these are just portions that seem to be very similar to the type of language that would have been used for ancient storm gods. Other references and motifs that are used for Yahweh, that are also found in Baal, or used for Baal, in the older Ugaritic text, includes the following, and I've got a list here of 7 of them, and this is what we're going to be ending off with today. So it's just a quick comparison between specific psalms and specific Ugaritic texts. I've got the names and the references for the Ugaritic text. I'm not going to read that out. It's KTU 1.24, verse 7 to 15. I'm not going to read that out. Nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. If you need them, let me know. I'll send them to you. But here are some of the things that scholars have pointed to, saying that it seems like Yahweh is taking on storm god epithets and motifs in the Hebrew Bible. Number one is a comparison between Psalm 29 and the Baal cycle. In Psalm 29, verse 3 to 10, Yahweh is described as ruling over the waters, thundering and shaking the wilderness. In the Baal cycle, Baal is the god of storms and thunder, who defeats Yam, the sea, the waters, right? And establishes his kingship. Now, often, I'm not sure if it's the case in Psalm 29, but often the word for waters is actually Yam in the Bible. We don't see that because it's English translation, but it is uncanny. So the parallel here is that both are depicted as a storm deity who has dominion over waters, the sea, right? But also the storms. Second one is found in Psalm 68, verse 4 and verse 7 to 10. Here we have Yahweh as portrayed as, let me read it for you, extol him who rides on the clouds. This is very typical storm god language. The Baal texts say Baal is repeatedly in the Baal text called the rider of the clouds. This is very strong and it's very close. Both use the epithet of storm deity that rule from the clouds. And the clouds are like their vehicle taking them to where they have to judge, or where they have to, or judge by rain or by flood or by storm or lightning, whatever the case may be. The third one is found in Psalm 18, verse 7 to 15. It describes Yahweh as shaking the earth. And this is kind of what happens when lightning and thunder comes. The other night we had lightning here that for the first time my house shook when that lightning bolt hit. It describes Yahweh shaking the earth with smoke and fire from his nostrils, clouds, lightning, and thunder. The Baal text, there, Baal is associated with these type of stormy theophanies, and a theophany is like an appearance of a god, also in terms of lightning and thunder as symbols of his divine power. Okay. Number 4, Psalm 77, 16 to 20. Yahweh is depicted as parting the waters, causing the sea to tremble. Now, this is a recurring motif in the Bible. God is always dividing, breaking, and crushing the waters. It starts in Genesis. We find it in the flood narrative. We find it in Exodus narrative again. And then we also find it in all these other creation passages that seem to sometimes reflect back to Exodus or forward to Exodus, if you like, but that also clearly shows us an influence of Chaoskampf, where in the beginning God was busy fighting some sea monster to bring order. That seems to be this is what this series is about. If you want to go back to some of the earlier sessions, I spent some time on them there. Baal, of course, in the Baal text, he battles Yam, he battles the sea, and this is how he gets divine authority over the gods and so on. So both are portrayed as having divine conquest over the chaotic waters. In Psalm 89, verse 5 to 10, Yahweh rules over the sea and he crushes Rahab. Now, Rahab is identified and the Tannin, the dragons. We've shown that a little bit early on in our series. Baal does the same. He defeats the sea, which in his case is called Yam. And as I've just mentioned, often in some of these texts, the sea is also called Yam in the Hebrew Bible. Now, granted, the word Yam also means sea. But in context, it just seems very clear that it's the same type of motive. that's running. Also, just considering that the Baal texts are way older than the Hebrew Bible. Okay. So both texts depict the God's control over the sea, which is often depicted and personified as a rebellious force of chaos, right? Psalm 93, verse 3 to 4, Yahweh is mightier than the raging seas and the floods. The sea, obviously, and the floods seem to have been the most powerful force of, well, today we'll call the force of nature, that was affecting the people of that time. They did not see it as a force of nature. We can understand why storms form, how they work, why clouds bring rain. They didn't. They saw these threats to their survival as the act of gods. All right. Baal is also victorious over these forces of chaos and establishes order. Right, last one, Psalm 104, verse 1 to 4. Yahweh is clothed in light, he rides on the winds, and he controls the natural forces. Baal is closely associated with winds, storms, and cosmic order. Both depict the deity as ruler of these cosmic forces, which today we would just call the forces of nature. The conclusion from this is a very simple one. These psalms incorporate and reframe a common Near Eastern storm god imagery to affirm Yahweh's supremacy. Let me just read that one more time slowly. These psalms in the Hebrew Bible by the Hebrew writers, they incorporate and they reframe, rephrase, reinterpret common Near Eastern storm god imagery to affirm Yahweh's supremacy. The Israelite authors may have borrowed or polemically repurposed their motives to show Yahweh rather than Baal as the true ruler of creation. We're going to end this today here. Um, and then next week, we're going to have a look with the origins of the Leviathan, right? To get a little bit back on track. But I think storm god imagery is important to understand because it's out of the storm god motif that we get the Leviathan, the Lotan, the Tannin, the Rahab, and all of these chaos motifs that need to be defeated in order to move forward. I see I've got 2.5 minutes left, and I just want to mention something which I really found incredibly interesting. Last week I said that Revelation is based on Chaoskampf motif. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Whether Revelation is a true reflection of what happened or is going to happen, put that aside. There's no doubt in my mind that the undergirding motif in the book of Revelation is a God, a father figure God, who has a son that comes and defeats chaos monsters from the sea. When he does that, he inaugurates order, he defeats death, and becomes the king. That's the overarching message of the book of Revelation. And that is also the overarching message of the Baal cycle, and to some degree in Enuma Elish. And often in all the Chaoskampf motifs, you have this type of picture. What it is interesting is that Revelation is widely understood by scholars to be a newer version of the book of Daniel and the book of Enoch, and possibly also Ezekiel. Now, these books, Ezekiel, but more so Daniel and Enoch, were books that became very popular and highly influential during the apocalyptic ideas of Second Temple Judaism. And if you go back, Enoch, I don't know that well, although I have read most of Enoch, but of course Daniel I know quite well. I've been preaching from it for so many years. But the book of Daniel, once again, is there's a God that sits in the heavens, depicted as Yahweh, of course, and there's judgment seats. In other words, who's sitting on these seats? Well, there's it's a heavenly assembly, and I would not be surprised if this is the divine council of Psalm 82 and other portions of the Old Testament, which you also find in the Ugaritic text. The high God sits, and there's lesser beings, gods, like in Job, that come and sit as part of his council. But then there is this rider on the clouds, right? Now you'll understand it. The rider on the clouds, which is called one like the Son of Man, comes and he defeats these beasts, right? And to him is then given kingdom and a dominion, and so on. There is no doubt in my mind that this is based on a simple understanding of Chaoskampf. And that's why Revelation continues this idea. I could say so much about this, but one of the things that really strike me is that if you study the book of Mark, Jesus as Son of Man, as Mark depicts him, is one of the ways in which some scholars will argue that Jesus was in fact divine, because the Son of Man has to be divine, right? Now, if you go back to the book of Daniel, there is nothing in the book of Daniel that shows that the Son of Man is divine. In fact, if you a plain reading of Daniel simply means he's a representative of all the saints. These are humans, except for one thing that even the most fundamentalist scholars will agree on or will use to show that the Son of Man has to be divine. He comes on the clouds. How do they know that that is a divine attribute? Comes from Chaoskampf, comes from Storm God imagery. And that blew my mind. Have a good Sunday. I'll see you next time. Cheers.